بیننده عزیز، اسم من مریم آتش نوابی هست و من شما را دعوت می کنم برای تماشای اولین برنامه پل. در برنامه‌های پل با شخصیت‌های خارجی و داخلی در خارج از کشور گفتگو داریم و موضوعات مختلف از اراکین دولت و دنیای سیاست تا هنر و فرهنگ صحبت خواهیم داشت. We begin in English for my first guest. Former U.S. Congressman Charlie Wilson led a campaign to help Afghans defeat the Soviet Union by secretly providing funding from the U.S. Congress for weapons and training. His incredible story was made into a movie starring American actors Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts.
We're going to get the money.
I spoke with the former congressman when he recently returned to Washington, D.C. It's an honor, Congressman Wilson, to have you on our first show.
Thank you, Mariam. It's an honor to be here.
You grew up in a small town in a very conservative part of Texas.
Right.
What did you know about Afghanistan before you went to Congress?
Nothing. The first that my constituents had heard about Afghanistan was when the Soviets invaded in 1979.
In about 1982, you took a trip to Peshawar and you saw Afghans in the refugee camps?
That's right. It was a great epiphany for me. I didn't ever expect to see 3 million refugees. And I certainly didn't ever anticipate seeing people treated the way that they were treated, mistreated the way they were treated. The fact that they were being brutalized by the Soviet army. But the warriors were having to fight a battle that was so one-sided because they had no weapons with which to fight.
The movie Charlie Wilson's War, there was a moment that you decided it was important to help Afghanistan, where you saw the boy with his hands cut off.
There were so many children that had been deliberately wounded by the evil empire, by the Soviet Union, that it just brought great emotions. And they were hands blown off, arms blown off, legs blown off, and it just, I had a feeling, a message from God or somebody that told me that as long as I had a breath in my body, that it was my duty to help them.
After you returned, you partnered with the CIA agent, Gus Avocados?
Yes. Gus was much more helpful to the Mujahideen than I was, really. And Gus just had a determination, as I did, but his was perhaps a little more volatile than mine.
When an Afghan freedom fighter gets captured, it can't be with an American-made weapon on him. That's how Cold War turns into an actual war, and that's something you want to keep a good eye on.
So anything we give them has to look like it could have plausibly been captured from the Soviets.
Yeah, that's right.
You know who's good at that?
Israel and Egypt.
And he was just absolutely determined that we were going to make the Soviets pay for this.
It could cost as much as $40 million.
I can get the appropriation.
Yeah, how?
We had to be very secretive about it. We couldn't let it be known. The CIA itself, the official CIA, was not in favor of doing the things that we were doing to help the Afghans because they were a bit more stodgy and were more afraid that we would anger the Soviet Union to where they might take more serious steps against Pakistan. But for somehow, Gus and I did not believe that it would work out that way. We didn't think that the Soviets wanted a much greater, wider war.
But you were able to get funding for Afghanistan, and that was one of the keys. You started with $5 million in 1983, and you helped get up to $1 billion in 1989. And you were able to do this by getting unanimous consent of the committee, and because of your relationship with other members who, at one time, you had said they owed you favors, and you were using that to help Afghanistan.
That's right. I would just make the case, and these guys were all good guys, and they didn't like what the Soviet Union did either, and they wanted to make them pay as well. And then the whole secret of our success was not having any leaks, because if we had had leaks, and if we had had a lot of discussion, and the news media had become interested in it, well, in all probability, it would not have been successful.
Do you think that that would be possible today in today's Congress?
No. Today's Congress has grown far more partisan. It would have been impossible to have had 9 or 10 people that would have everyone been willing to keep the secret.
There was an interesting character in the whole story named Joanne Herring.
Right, a woman in Houston, a friend of mine, and Joanne was a very active anti-communist, was her basic motivation. And she was significant in persuading me to go in the first place.
What role did she play in getting the chairman of the Appropriations Committee at the time, Doc Long, to provide the funding for the Mujahideen?
She was very charming, and she had a lot to do with persuading Doc that it was a good cause.
They only want to go back there and fight.
And you're their savior, Mr. Chairman.
No, I wouldn't go that far. Watch this, she's going to lock it right on.
These people have been waiting for you. They have been sitting here and bleeding and waiting and praying for you. It's only going to be a man like you who can save them. We know, don't we, about our men, what they can do when they summon themselves.
At the time, you were able to create this coalition between the U.S., Israel, Egypt, and Pakistan to ship arms to the Mujahideen. How
And
were you
China.
able? And China.
It wasn't a question of begging the Israelis or begging the Egyptians or persuading the Chinese. Everybody thought that it was a very unfair and unjust war. And everybody wanted to try to give a lesson to the Soviet Union that they shouldn't do this sort of thing. And of course the United States and Saudi Arabia were providing the money to pay them for the weapons that they furnished.
Do you think that would be possible today to build that coalition?
No. It would have been too open to the press. There would have been a great many questions. And I just don't believe that it would have been at all possible if there was not a complete secrecy. There would have been an enormous amount of controversy in 1982 or 1983, especially when people didn't think the Afghans could win.
And when was it that people found out about this, the funding and this coalition?
Oh, it began to, after 1986, after the Stinger missiles began to shoot down all the Soviet helicopters. After that time, it became to be a little bit common knowledge. But by that time, it was too late because the wheels of the war were turning big time, and everyone was excited about what was an apparent Soviet defeat.
But after they made the decision to fight to the end, no matter what they had, then I said we just simply can't allow people this brave and this deserving to sell their lives cheaply.
The real heroes of this war were the Mujahideen. They were the Afghan foot soldiers that were just magnificent in their courage and their ability to destroy Soviet formations. The Afghans showed that the Red Army was not indestructible, and by causing the Soviets to retreat back to the Soviet Union, it weakened the Red Army in the Politburo. And when the Berlin Wall came down 11 months after the Soviets withdrew, there was no military option for the Soviets because they had lost their influence, and Gorbachev was able to say, we're not going to continue this war.
When we come back, the turning point in the battle against the Soviet Union, when our conversation with former U.S. Congressman Charlie Wilson continues after this. Charlie Wilson's war, as it later came to be known in America, faced enormous challenges, not the least of which was convincing key government officials to provide Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen. What support did you get from President Reagan in the White House?
Well, President Reagan was extremely important because very few people in his administration wanted to give the Stinger missiles. The State Department was opposed. Some people even in the CIA were opposed. The United States Army in particular was opposed. And Reagan just simply, as best I can tell, just overrode his aides and his whole administration and furnished the Stinger missiles.
What support did you have from the CIA director at the time, Bill Casey?
Bill Casey came around. At first he was very much opposed. I took 4 mujahideen who were visiting in Washington to try to get more support. And I took 4 of them over to Mr. Casey's office. Mr. Casey was a very devout Catholic, very religious Catholic, and he quickly picked up on the religious aspects of the Mujahideen's effort, and it made a big difference to him. I told him when we were sitting there and the Afghan warriors had asked for a short recess so they could do their prayers. And they were kneeling, facing Mecca and praying, and I was sitting by Mr. Casey, sitting down, wasn't on the floor, and I said to him that we simply could not allow men this brave to sell their lives so cheaply. And he says, no, we can't, and we're not going to anymore.
So that was a turning point.
It was a turning point for him, just like the mountains and the refugee camps were a turning point for me.
Going back to the Stingers, because that was also a turning point in the war?
Well, it was the turning point militarily, and that was on September 26, 1986. 4 Soviet helicopters came in to land in Jalalabad, and the Mujahideen fired 4 missiles and shot down 3 helicopters. And so from that time on, the Soviets didn't want to go near their helicopters.
What was the reaction in Washington?
It was just spectacular. Nobody really thought they were going to work. And that was the first time that they really thought that the Mujahideen might be successful.
What larger role do you think Charlie Wilson's war, this secret war, played in the breakup of the Soviet Union?
It played a very important role. But again, Charlie Wilson wasn't nearly as important as the brave warriors.
After that period of time, the U.S. stopped funding Afghanistan, and you had a meeting with the Appropriations Committee and asked for funding for schools.
We've spent billions. Let's spend $1 million on HR 118 and rebuild a school.
Charlie, nobody gives a shit about a school in Pakistan.
Afghanistan.
No one was interested because by that time the Berlin Wall had come down. All of the American focus was based on Eastern Europe, was based on helping East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, helping all those countries form democracies. And the war in Afghanistan, which really made a lot of this possible, was just no longer of great interest to the Americans. If we had provided the education funds, the agriculture funds, the basic infrastructure like roads and electrical lines and generation and all those things, it would have given them, in my opinion, it would have given the Afghans a lot more hope and made it easier to establish a orderly government. Nobody had ever heard of the Taliban at that time, and I don't think that it would have ever happened. It would have been a very small amount of money compared to what we've spent since then.
Defense Secretary Robert Gates said that up to 3 more combat brigades will be sent to Afghanistan. Do you think this is the right approach?
I don't know anything else to do, really. We have several reasons to do that. One is to try to defeat the Taliban, if we can, and try to have a sensible civilian government for Afghanistan. Another reason is that we need to catch bin Laden, and that's the only way to do that. I believe that he is in the tribal areas. I might have occupied some of the same caves that he's currently occupying.
Do you think that the U.S. military is justified in engaging in operations now across the border into Pakistan?
If we knew where Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda operatives really were, and we had the forces, the American forces necessary there on the border, I think we should go get them. Yeah. And try to make it up to Pakistan however we could.
What do you think is the most important step now that the U.S. can take in Afghanistan?
Well, assuming that we could reach some sort of military and political stability, the best steps we could take would be to do more and more and more to help the civilian government gain strength and provide hope for its people.
millions of Afghans who are now learning about your contribution to the country. How would you like them to remember you?
Well, I'd just like for them to remember me as a good friend, and not as a hero, but that somebody who really and truly wanted to help, and perhaps did help a little bit.
My thanks to former U.S. Congressman Charlie Wilson. When we come back, tensions in Afghanistan today. We'll talk with a member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations who recently returned from the region. Dan Markey is a senior fellow at the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, focusing on India, Pakistan, and South Asia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
The U.S. Congress refused Charlie Wilson's request for funding to help rebuild Afghanistan after the defeat of the Soviet Union. If he had gotten the money, do you think that the Taliban would have come into power?
The problem of the Taliban was a problem not of an especially impressive or appealing ideology that they espoused, but the problem of the failure of the state and the feuding warlords who came into place after the Soviets left. So it was an absence of political power, a weakness of the state, a lack of other opportunities that ultimately gave birth to the Taliban. And so in that respect, it's possible that he's absolutely right. The United States had stayed, had done more, had really tried to develop the country, had invested in the people and in the government, they might have been able to withstand what eventually emerged with the Taliban.
The U.S. has said several times, we've learned from that prior mistake, and this time we're here to stay and help. Do you think the U.S. will long-term help Afghanistan truly rebuild?
I think we can. I think if you look at the politics of Washington, D.C. and in the United States, Afghanistan is still sort of the popular war. But if it takes a nosedive in terms of we see significantly more casualties, if it doesn't look like the people of Afghanistan want the United States to stick around, then maybe the cries of leaving won't seem so strange or ill-founded.
The U.S. has recently been conducting these controversial military operations in Pakistan, and Charlie Wilson has said that these are now necessary. But what do you think the U.S. should be doing to go into these so-called sanctuaries?
Well, right now, by all accounts, it appears the United States is using these Predator drone strikes to hit terrorist targets, both in the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, and now we're even seeing them somewhat outside of that area, going further into the settled areas of Pakistan. These are probably necessary as disruptive moves in the very near term. By most accounts, al-Qaeda has actually been able to regroup, has grown stronger in the sanctuaries in Pakistan, and even the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban, have been able to regroup over the past few years. So these kinds of attacks will be necessary to at least put some of their leadership on the run, to serve notice that they can't just simply find safe haven in Pakistan. Over the longer run, though, I don't think that these can possibly succeed. I think what they do is they probably, the enemy will respond, and they can respond in a variety of ways. One of them we're seeing attacks on convoys of material going through Pakistan into Afghanistan. That's one way that the Taliban